This is another iRaw podcast.
And the kind of, like I said, the implication behind that is you change all of that, and then we have this kind of very nice dog-human relationship as we've always had. We've removed the kind of pressures of modern life, and there we have the dog-human relationship in all its magic. So that is not that is my problem with that argument. What that argument does is it doesn't touch the dog-human relationship as an idea at all. It keeps that idea completely intact. It's possible to make that argument and never go close to whether that relationship between dogs and humans is actually all right under any circumstances.
Welcome back to Season 7 of the Animal Tone podcast. This season, we're looking at animals and multi-species health. And in today's episode, we're talking about what I think is a really fascinating and interesting concept, species story, the kind of narratives and discourses and stories that tend to follow specific species around. And of course, over the course of the season, we're speaking primarily about dogs. And the person who made the species story a kind of political concept and really drove home what it is our guest today, Mariam Motamedi-Fraser, who is an Honorary Senior Research Fellow in the Interdisciplinary Research Group at UCL Anthropocene in the Department of Geography. Her research is located in the field of animal studies, and she's particularly interested in the implications for animals of the concepts and theories that are deployed to explain them, both in science and non-science research. Mariam is the author of 3 monographs and 2 co-edited collections and is published in a wide range of journals. Her most recent book, which we talk about a lot in today's episode, is Dog Politics, Species Stories and the Animal Sciences. This book offers a critical analysis of the idea that relationality with humans somehow constitutes dogs' evolutionary destiny. The book is partly informed by her experience of volunteering at the Dog Hub, a dog training and behavioural centre in London. Mariam is strongly committed to teaching animal studies and to the transformative experiences that learning about animals in a structured setting offers students. I had a really wonderful time talking to Mariam. You'll hear me throughout the episode getting really excited, I think, about the implications of species story, and not only for dogs and the ways in which we understand dogs, but I think this concept has a lot of purchase when we start to think about it in relationship to the stories that we tell of a variety of different species. Just a reminder that the Animal Tone is sponsored by Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, a research group in Kingston, Canada. And this season is jointly sponsored with the Remaking One Health Indies project, led by the wonderful Krithika Srinivasan. Thank you so much to the sponsors, and thank you to you, dear listeners, for joining in, for listening to the show, for leaving reviews and ratings and doing all of that good stuff. I really, really so value and appreciate your time and effort and energy in doing that. Okay, strap yourselves in. It's a good conversation. Here we go. Hello, Mariam. Welcome to the Animal Tone podcast.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here, Claudia, as you know.
So today we're going to be focused on the idea of species story, which when I first heard it, I was really taken aback because it felt to me like this concept captured something I've been struggling to put into words for a long time. And that's kind of the essentialization of animals in many ways. But you do this interesting move where you go backwards in time and you say, well, how have our ideas of animals, and in your case, dogs, been shaped through history, I suppose. So I'm really looking forward to kind of unpacking what species story is and why thinking about species story is important when we think about health, in particular dog health. But before we get into that, let's learn a little bit about you, Mariam. How did you come to be interested in animals and writing this incredible book, Dog Politics?
Well, I suppose there's an intellectual trajectory and there's a personal trajectory. I'm a bit wary of new destiny stories, as Vincent de Prey puts it, but nevertheless. In terms of animals in general, I come from a very animal-oriented family, but not in any way that is a kind of, animals are kind of integrated into the family without comment. So it's not something that is a big deal in the family. It's just like part of life. So I think that has been a background for me. But I do also think there has to be a moment where what is kind of even something like a second nature to you you become more conscious of it, or it becomes kind of clear to you. And that really happened to me. I had quite a long period of illness. And I had intellectual trajectory that was kind of leading its way to animals. I started working in the field of health and then moved to the body, kind of new materialism and affect material. I wrote a book on non-linguistic word relations, so relationships with words that aren't within the frame of language. And I always knew that that book should have had a chapter on animals in it, but I didn't feel kind of confident with the literature in order to do it at that time. And it was around that time, in just a few months after that book was published, that I took 2 years out on medical leave. During that period, I also met Susan Close, who runs the Dog Hub in London, which is a very unusual training centre for dogs, training and behavioural centre. And she was very supportive and strangely asked me to volunteer at the Dog Hub. And I think that was really a prompt to start formalising the relationships that I had built with various animals, but also with the kind of idea of animals. And over that period of 2 years, it was very important to me working in the Dog Hub. And Susan Close has been a huge influence on the way I think about animals, but especially the way that I think about dogs. I wish I had come to animal studies earlier in my career, but on the other hand, I also think that the work that I did before, particularly a long-term preoccupation with science, has been very helpful in terms of informing the way that I come to animal studies finally at this late stage.
I think the way we all come to animal studies is kind of through most of us. I think it's very rare to find anyone who started in animal studies, right? We've all come with kind of different disciplinary backgrounds that have brought us to animals and to thinking about animals, and some of us with a much more political intent, I think, than others. But it's an interesting story, especially what you were saying there about second nature, because one of the things guests always say is, I love animals and I grew up with animals. Everyone kind of says that I love animals, I grew up with animals. But that kind of consciousness raising moment, that moment when they become apparent to you, like really as individuals, they are very much in themselves. I think that's really something quite different. And I remember speaking to Paula Akari on the show, and it's a phrase I say often in my mind, even when I'm walking or when I find myself maybe disregarding Linus, my dog's needs, is they so readily become the wallpaper of our lives. And I think that's such a profound thing, because you can live with animals, you can love animals, but still somehow the animals in our lives, like pets, our dogs, our cats, can become nothing but wallpaper to our interests.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I really resonate with what you're saying there. But you mentioned the Dog Hub, which is a pretty remarkable place in and of itself. So maybe you could walk us through the Dog Hub and the work they do before we jump into speaking about Species Story.
So Susan set it up about, I'm not sure, I think around 20 years ago. She worked with horses before that and then moved to dogs. She, I think, started off taking private clients mostly, but moved gradually into, basically, to cut a long story short, work very much within the communities that she lives, which is in Euston in London, which is an inner city part of the London, very, very diverse community. And possibly over the period that I met her, but possibly earlier, I think her way of thinking about dogs in the community changed very much. Anyway, the upshot was that Camden Council, which is the local authority, but the borough that she lives in, started to fund part of the Dog Hub. And by funding her, what that meant was that she became involved with council business. So whether there were things to do with social services or police or troubleshooting and so on, basically kind of being there to make assessments on their behalf, but also troubleshooting and stopping things escalating out of control. Or usually families, situations in where dogs are present. So to give a very neutral example, before people can, well, it's not neutral actually, but a less controversial example, before people can adopt a child, for example, if they have a dog, then the relationship of the family to the dog and so on has to be assessed so that there's no danger to the incoming child, risk to the incoming child. And this led also to providing free training and support and advice to anyone who lives in the borough. So anyone who lives in Camden can come to puppy classes, can come to advanced dog training classes, can become involved in the dog hub, can bring their dogs if they've got problems, can have long-term support with their dogs and so on. So one of the things for me that is significant about that, and it relates to what we're saying about background noise, Susan, it basically means that dogs are not allowed to be background noise in that kind of way. It's that very privatized relationship with dogs, which you were kind of gesturing to earlier about you living with them, they're in your house. It basically puts dogs on the map in a different kind of way. Dogs are part of our community. We live with dogs. We all live with dogs. We live with dogs in different ways. And it's a kind of form of support. So, because I can't think of any kind of human relationship that doesn't have some kind of outside support. You know, there are always these kind of structural things in place, whether they're schools or hospitals or whatever they are. They're always there for humans. And in some ways, the Dog Hub is a bit like that. It's like a kind of public. It makes dog ownership and responsibilities for dog a public concern and not merely a private concern. So obviously the Dog Hub has been very involved in, Susan's very, very critical of the council, I should say. You know, part of their work that she does is about helping the council members or staff to understand dogs differently, to understand the pressures that dogs are under differently, to understand the pressures that humans are under differently, and basically to kind of change the way in which we think about dogs. It's just like you buy one, it comes in your house, and that's the end of the story, and who knows what goes on. It's much more about kind of integrating dogs as part of our lives. So I think that's really a huge achievement on the part of Susan and very underplayed. I think the fact that everything is free is also really important, because the commercialization of dogs obviously is hugely significant, but also the very high costs of dogs, increasingly high costs of dogs, particularly in terms of veterinary care. So all of those, there are other organisations obviously that provide free services like street vets and so on, who will give veterinary support to people who live on the streets with dogs. But they are few and far between, to be honest. And I think one of the things they do is help us to understand that dogs are not background noise, that dogs truly are a part of our communities. And it's about helping people to understand that, and above all, helping the council to understand that. So moving in there earlier, before things get out of control, stopping the council taking actions which will be damaging for families or for people or for dogs and so on. So it's always about thinking about it in terms of this kind of integration.
No, that sounds, I mean, I really appreciate the Dog Hub, kind of the civil orientation of the Dog Hub. I'm aware of other organizations that, as you say, provide free veterinary services, but maybe perhaps aren't thinking in this kind of civil way about dogs. How are dogs part of our urban societies? I mean, even people who don't, because dogs are still thought of as property, even people who don't own dogs should be thinking about dogs as part of their societies. And I think so often that conversation is put about in very definitive terms. We ban dogs or we allow dogs. It's never actually a negotiation of how we manage and work through living in a shared society. And, you know, a small thing for me is about language and learning how to read dogs for people who also don't have dogs. You know, something you often see on streets of cities is people who are not exposed to dogs jumping away or afraid or terrified or screaming. And there's a lot to be said about how we can learn to have a bit more tolerance and awareness of how other species move through our cities. And of course, this could go beyond dogs to other animals as well. But having an organization that does that kind of political work is really, really important.
I should say I see Susan's work as political. I'm not sure that she does. But just to go back to your point about people being frightened of dogs. So one of the things that I've noticed about the Dog Hub is that the issue of dogs often is really not about dogs at all. It's about relations between humans in which the dog becomes a cipher, a way to kind of antagonize a problem. So just to give a really basic example, you've got one neighbor complaining about another neighbor, which is that the dog is barking all the time. So that would be a kind of classic situation where Susan might go in. And one of the things there is obviously to understand why the dog is barking and to help the dog not to bark, because the dog is barking for a reason, and we want to know what that reason is. It's usually a holistic reason. It's not to do with one thing. But before that, you have to find out, is the dog actually barking that much? You know, is the dog barking, or have things have become so intense between these two houses that there might be a misunderstanding as to actually whether this dog does bark all the time. So that can just be
You are resonating. I cannot even tell you how much this has literally happened to me. We got Linus. We adopted him from the shelter in Canada, and we were second story in an apartment block. And this was just as COVID hit. So everyone was also home. And my neighbor downstairs started just complaining about noise, but like all sorts of noise. But Linus literally didn't bark for the first 6 months. And I know that this is a common phenomenon that happens with shelter dogs. I think he maybe barked once or twice over the first 6 months we had him. Didn't wag his tail, didn't bark. He was obviously quite traumatized. But the number of complaints she would send to our landlord about dog barking and was unbelievable. And I would get so enraged, and it literally devolved. At some point, it became nothing to do with Linus. It devolved into just neighbors shouting at each other over. Yeah, anyway, so sorry, I had to say, like, as you were talking, I'm like, you're speaking about my life.
No, that's it. Yes, that's yeah, so that is a really common issue. And I mean, we had an issue with one of our neighbors, and based on the experience of my experience of the dog hub, I did actually record how many times this sound was occurring, because I thought, well, you know, I'm as vulnerable to that as anybody else is. And in fact, it was really hugely helpful to do that diary, because I realized actually the sound that I was worried about wasn't occurring as often as I thought. And it was, I had got into a kind of state about it. So a lot of that dog hub's work is about protecting the dog from the way in which it gets used between people. And of course, this is no surprise to anybody that this should happen. So, but also, I mean, obviously, if there is a problem with the dog, then you also want to be there to try to make a better relationship in that environment for the dog, so the dog can survive it and possibly even thrive in it.
Well, it seems clear to me already that this is a question of health for society, health for communities, health for families, and certainly health for the dogs and the humans that we are talking about. And yeah, I think we're always kind of caught in this odd dilemma of trying to set up institutions so that we can make change, because institutions and structures like these do facilitate change, while at the same time kind of being cautious that they can also become damaging in their own right over time. Because even when it comes to law, you know, something that's really, I think, quite important and transformative and can be really transformative to animals' lives is precarious, because it's subject to change. It's subject to the whims of what we decide is appropriate or inappropriate. And I think part of the tension and problem with talking through these structures and how it impacts dogs and humans is the species story. So maybe we can start talking about that with perhaps a broad introduction to what is it you mean when you say species story?
Yeah, so well, if it's all right, I'll just go back again a bit to not to the dog hub, but to how the concept of a species story came about for me. I think it's incredibly difficult to talk about dogs, in fact. It's obviously, there's been a lot of brilliant work on dogs, but this issue, as Erica Fudge puts it, as an animal, a pet not being an animal, and also the kind of intimacy that humans have with dogs, or perceived intimacy that they have with dogs, dogs just are very difficult animals in some sense, precisely on account of their proximity to humans to think about. And when I was working in the dog hub, I mean, I really wanted to just write a book about dogs. That was just really what, but I just couldn't kind of get past something about what was informing the ways in which humans related to their dogs. And obviously in the dog hub, you do see a lot of problems, because that's necessarily a place where people go when there are problems. You go to a behaviourist. But you also do very enjoyable things like puppy classes, advanced training, you know, all those kinds of things. But still, in every context, I just felt like there's something about dogs that I can't quite get my finger on. And it was difficult as well to think about the concept of species, because, again, this is a very difficult concept. You know, I think intuitively we probably don't like the concept. It's a category. It categorizes. It's a generalizing concept. and all those kinds of things. So species itself has been very difficult. And I think social scientists and humanities scholars have struggled a bit with that concept. You know, we have tried to undermine it, but somehow it's rather obdurate kind of concept that keeps coming back to us over and over again. So these two quite different and difficult concepts. And it wasn't that I was thinking about dogs in terms of species when I was thinking, why are dogs so difficult to think through and think about? What I was actually thinking about was this story about dogs. You know, so I wasn't thinking of dogs as a species. I was thinking there's such a very strong story that follows dogs around. I mean, I think there are other animals as well, but I'm less familiar with them. I think cats, obviously, in particular, and horses. But dogs, wow. I mean, that story is, this word is going to come up quite a lot for some reason during this discussion, I think. Second nature. I mean, it's just like it's barely credited with any attention, this idea that dogs and humans have this strong relationship with each other. I think that for me was partly what fell apart in the dog hub. Even this is not to say that things were going badly wrong in the dog hub. On the contrary, things were going very well, but it was partly the amount of work that was involved in things going well, even in the most positive contexts, like, you know, classes that are for enjoyment for everybody. But also my question about whether they were going well for dogs, in fact, you know, whether the achievement of a good relationship for a human was necessarily the achievement of a good relationship for a dog. And that was also something that really struck me in the dog hub. So in that environment, there seemed to be a lot of contradictory and ambiguous things going on, and kind of very ambivalent outcomes in some senses as well. And so I have worked on the concept of stories a lot in the past. I've taught a course with Yasmin Gunaratnam on stories, but I wasn't, again, conscious of that history of my own when I came to the concept of story. It was literally that there is a story about dogs. It's literally like there is a story about dogs and it's in the room with us all the time. And that's how those three concepts came together.
So if I understand you correctly, there's this kind of taken for granted narrative or idea that dogs and humans belong with each other, we're good for each other. It's just kind of taken for granted. We're like, yeah, that's true. And very little critical attention has actually been given to whether or not that is in fact the case, because dogs' story, what makes a dog is so entangled with being paired with humans. It's like our imagination of a dog outside of a dog next to a human or by a human, they no longer become a dog somehow.
But also it's super easy at that point, the point that you just got to there, it's super easy to say it's to do with modern life. That the problem is the conditions under which dogs live. And so I make this distinction quite early in the book which I take from Adrienne Rich, which is a distinction between the quantum leap and the contemporary emergency. Clearly there is an emergency for dogs and also for humans in some ways. The conditions under which we live are extremely stressful, especially in cities, which is where the dog hub is based. And we can talk a lot, and in fact we have talked a lot at length about the fact that dogs are alone a lot, the fact that dogs, you know, like humans, are becoming increasingly overweight, such that it's damaging to the health. We can talk about the traffic in puppies and the puppy farms and so on. There are hundreds and hundreds of things that we can talk about which are really bad for dogs, which one could say is reducible to the circumstances. And the reason that is relevant is because to frame the argument in that way is to imply that if the circumstances were to change, so if I lived in a bigger house with a big garden and I was at home all the time, I was retired and I could take my dog out all the time and all the rest of it, and we didn't live in a polluted environment and I fed him the right food and all the rest of it, the dog would be fine, right? So it's like the problems of dogs are not integral to the dog-human relationship. They're integral to the conditions under which dogs and humans live together today, which is a much broader problem of cities and urban life and modern life, and all of that could be changed. And the kind of, like I said, the implication behind that is you change all of that, and then we have this kind of very nice dog-human relationship as we've always had. We've removed the kind of pressures of modern life, and there we have the dog-human relationship in all its magic. So that is not that is my problem with that argument. What that argument does is it doesn't touch the dog-human relationship as an idea at all. It keeps that idea completely intact. It's possible to make that argument and never go close to whether that relationship between dogs and humans is actually all right under any circumstances.
Yeah, and this comes back to, I guess, a lot of what you're saying here makes me think about a conversation I had with Yamini Narayanan about cows in India. Because, certainly cows in India have a very strong species story, and it's one that's entangled with ideas of religion and being sacralized. And a key thing Yamini said in that interview was how the second the cow became a god, the cow no longer became a cow. Your ability to actually see the cow standing in front of you became really, really, really difficult. And of course, this is a different context. And I think we will talk about how the species stories we're speaking about with regards to dogs here is a very Western species story of dogs. So often I've mentioned that 75% of the world's dogs are not in people's homes, and people are flawed. The folks I talk with are like, what? Dogs aren't pets? Like, that really befuddles people. The sacralization of the cows and the kind of human-dog bond, they're kind of protected. They're like above and beyond critique. You can't criticize them. And I think when you get to that, you often get to a really strong power relationship. What are our interests in really protecting this idea that human and dogs have always belonged with one another? And of course, this brings us to the question of domestication and how domestication is really political. It's not a taken for granted, easy, natural thing. Domestication is really a political practice.
Just on that subject of cows, that no longer is a cow, I know in animal studies there's been a lot of criticism, and rightly so, of the word animal. But I think one of the things that always strikes me in parallel to what you've just said there is how rarely people think the thought, there is an animal in your house. There's an animal in your house. So actually living with really quite a large animal often in the house, and think that, and what does that mean for that animal to be in the house in that way? So like, say, around domestication. And the problem for dogs is that because that relationship is naturalized, the idea that this is an animal in the house that has a completely different set of needs and desires probably to you or to how human houses are organized, makes it very difficult to kind of reconcile those two things, or to even appreciate the fact that this is an animal and not, and you see, I don't even have a word for it. I was going to say, and not a dog. So this is, so it's a bind. It's a kind of like a trap. It's really, I do think once you have a species story going like that, there are pitfalls and traps all over the place. That species stories set those kinds of traps for us. But you said Western, that's absolutely right, and I agree with you, but it's also in science. The book that I wrote is very much a snapshot of contemporary science, and there are lots of different ways in which you could have written that book, or you could write the story of dogs. And I think Justina Flodarczyk, is starting a very, very interesting project, and I hope she won't mind me saying this, very, very interesting project on the ways in which stories about dogs have changed, are different over time. So that you can do this in a very different way. And Eric Barate as well, who I mentioned in the book, has done an analysis of kind of generations of social and cultural dogs rather than biological dogs. What I've done is very much a snapshot of the present moment, and the snapshot is in science. So you said Western, and that's right. And also, as well as Western, also kind of the scientific canine science at the moment is very focused on Western, on the global north, dogs in the global north. Of course, there is work on dogs who are free roaming. And of course, scientists know about those dogs. But a lot of the kind of theories about dogs, or dogs' species story, is developed in this science, which focuses very much on dogs in the global north and in the West, and who live in family houses and all the rest of it, as they call it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting when you start to compare. It challenges the idea of species and the naturalization, as you said, of this human-dog bond, when you start to realize that there are just so many dogs who might rely on or be in and around human environments, but They are in no more or less ways, I think, than jackals, for example. Although that said, jackals are they're quite human adverse. They'll choose to run away from a human, whereas a dog might choose, not all dogs, but some dogs might choose to see if they can approach a human to get food or something along those lines. So certainly there's interesting human-dog relationships, but they need to be looked at in context-specific ways and individual-specific ways. I think there are certainly some dogs that are very human adverse, that would choose to run away from and not be near humans. And we fail, I think, when we have this very single story of dogs as being pets, to see the complexity of dog relationships in the world.
That's right. And I think what you said about domestication, as you said, is political. In dogs, the story, domestication seems, as far as I know, it seems almost unique in some ways, because the story of how dogs became a species, so the story of the becoming of dogs in science, is through domestication. So without domestication, dogs would not have become a species. Put that in a really simple way. I'm just going to take this off the top of my head. I'm not sure if it's completely accurate, but let's just say wild ox. So wild ox is a wild ox. It is a species. And then it is domesticated. The story of dogs is slightly different to that. The story of dogs is that dogs were wolves until they were domesticated. Yeah, is that right? Yeah, so until they were domesticated. So basically what is being said here is that domestication is synonymous with speciation. So dogs would not have been dogs, or the evolutionary story would not have unfolded. That's not the right word to use in relation to evolutionary theory, but I'm going to use it. It is in terms of a story. But the story of dogs wouldn't have unfolded in the way that it did if there hadn't been domestication. So, this is the argument that dogs were the original domesticates. So their domestication precedes the agricultural revolution, which is when most other animals were domesticated. That speciation, as I've said, is connected to domestication, if not synonymous with it. So, as I said, dogs kind of transform themselves as a consequence of their relationship with humans. And as a consequence of that, then we have this kind of unique relationship between dogs and humans. So it's quite a distinct story in relation to domestication. One of the ways that it's very easy to capture, and I use this in teaching, there's a slide that I found, which is, it basically shows that, that kind of story that is told visually of the shape of the human body as it progresses, for example, from
an ape standing more upright.
Exactly. And alongside that very common visual, is a dog. So we've got the first dog howling at the moon, and that is obviously a wolf. And then it goes through kind of different shapes of dogs, and we end up with a dog on the lead, and a much smaller dog on the lead than some of the middle period dogs. The reason that picture is really important is because of the first position and the final position. So the dog is the wolf, and the whole way through that transition, that dog is standing next to a human, and then it ends up being the dog in the house today. Now, I'm not sure, I can't say for certain, but I don't think that there are any other species stories that have such a tight connection between the way in which an animal becomes what it is, a species becomes what it is, and humans, and what humans are up to. So domestication is political anyway, as you say, but in the case of dogs, the story that is told about dogs, the ways in which scientists make sense of what a dog is, domestication is not just a kind of, it's kind of profoundly ontological in these stories. You can't take domestication out of the dog.
But I think the same thing with other species. Like, I think, again, coming back to cows, again, I think how it's positioned in the story has to be looking at where the story is being told and for who. Because, again, domestication and cows, cows' physiology changed. It would be interesting to have that same dialogue with cows, because cows got much smaller and then much bigger. And then you've got the kind of same thing as dogs. You've got the expansion of the idea of cow through breeds, right? You've got breeding practices that really intervene in cows' bodies dramatically, so much so that today's cow and, the auroch both large animals would look very, very different because a Holstein cow would have swollen udders that are too big, producing more milk than she can possibly do. So there are these physiological changes. But the story that we've told with regards to cows and milk and human health also has sustaining power. But that's not premised, I think, in the same way as the intimacy with dogs. I feel like intimacy seems to be this key factor in the dog story that isn't as present in, let's say, a cow story or a chicken story, again, depending on the context you're in. Because I would suspect in India, for example, cows would feature much more prominently in terms of, let's say, a social cultural story of Indian communities than dogs would. And this is pure conjecture. I don't know myself. But either way, domestication in both of these has been a practice and a process that has shaped both the human, dogs, and cultures, environments that are involved.
I mean, it's interesting, the kind of power of the scientific argument around dogs. It's kind of astonishing to me in a way that story can exist given the diversity of human relationships with dogs and how few humans are actually in relations with dogs in this way. You know, to go back to the kind of thing of background noise, I mean, dogs, as you say, live everywhere all over the world, and mostly they're free roaming or not necessarily free roaming in a pure way, but they may have very complex setups in relation to human communities. You know, it's not, I don't think you can talk about a binary between captive dogs and free roaming dogs. I mean, dogs are making their ways in really complicated and interesting ways for themselves. But it's astonishing how in science, the story of domestication, so this is basically the story that without domestication, there would be no dog at all. We would just have wolves. It's kind of amazing the way that story, the power of that story, given the empirical evidence around the world. But one of the things that I think, again, it's relatively, so we can look to other forms of dogs living to criticize that story. But one of the things that was important for me to do was to not look at those stories, to look at the dogs exactly under our noses, you know, like to really not be, how can I put it? I think the temptation is to compare and contrast dogs in one part of the world with dogs in another part of the world. And then the evidence for the kind of tenuousness of dogs as species story will be made clear. And one of the things that was important to me about the book and in its political dimension was to actually look at the dogs that we live with, the dogs which apparently exemplify this intimate relationship, and to see how they are actually coping with it. So I think that's possibly the more surprising part of the book, is that it's not about looking at dogs elsewhere and looking at a different relationship between humans and dogs elsewhere in different forms of intimacy or not, that you can find the kind of evidence for the difficulty of that story for dogs in the very dogs that it is supposed to describe best.
And you mentioned this already earlier when talking about the dog hub, where you said maintaining or even creating the idea of this dog-human bond takes a great deal of work. It's not just a given or a taken. There's massive interventions that make this possible even today. So perhaps you could walk us a bit through, you know, what you mean when you say that it takes work and how dogs are dealing today with these kinds of, how does the species story, this taken for granted idea of the human-dog bond, how does it impact dogs today?
Well, in terms of the work, I spend quite a lot of time in the book talking about socialization theories and the role that they play in our understandings of dogs today. Gosh, there's so much to say about this, I don't even know where to start, but let me just try and stay focused. So apparently it's a natural relationship, the relationship between dogs and humans. That's the starting point. That's the kind of outcome of dogs as species story, that this relationship is somehow given in nature. So already we're in a really dangerous place, because that means that one might reasonably be led to expect that when you get a dog in your house, you'll immediately make friends with it and everything will be lovely from that point onwards. And in fact, that is often not the case. And I remember standing at a traffic light with Monk, who's the dog that I live with, when he was about 8 weeks old, and he was kind of squirming on the end of a lead at a busy road, and a cyclist stopped at the traffic lights, And she looked at me and she looked at Monk and she said, God, we gave our dog up after about 2 months, something like that, or 3 months or something like that. So she basically looked at that and what she saw was work. And she basically was saying in one sentence, God, we kind of got it and we thought we're not going to do the work. And so I think the idea that your dog moves in, everything is fine, that is, we've already got problems before we've even started. In fact, dogs, scientists would say, behaviorists would say, lots of people would say, dogs need a lot of socialization in order to live in a human household. And that socialization begins possibly before they're even born, but certainly from the moment they're born. And there is a massive science of socialization. I cannot exaggerate how enormous the field of science of socialization is. And some of it is to do with companion dogs. So how can we enable captive dogs to not exhibit behaviours that will make them likely to be relinquished or lead to euthanasia? But a lot of it is also to do with working dogs. So dogs who are going to go into the military will have very specific forms of socialization. Dogs who are going to be service dogs will have specific forms of socialization and so on. And all these theories are about working out in the most minute detail how exactly we can best enable a dog to live in a human environment and to basically to work for humans. That's really what a lot of that literature is about. It's predictive. How can we not train dogs, because it's not even at the level of training, it's kind of like sub-training.
It's like a constitution.
Yeah, how can we constitute dogs? Exactly. How can we constitute a dog enabled to live and work with humans? So in terms of so-called natural, it's astonishing the amount of work that goes into it. So that's, on the science side.
I take your point about even before they're born, because you just look at breeding practices, like each breed almost was like, you have a species story, but kind of sub to species stories is a breed story. You hear people speak about specific breeds in such a taken for granted way. Oh, I got this dog because these are the types of traits they have, or I got this dog. And it's not to say that there aren't elements of truth to that. Breeding does and can impact animals' emotions, docility. I mean, agricultural sciences kind of go on to prove this, that you can breed a certain amount of docility, but it has its limits. But I'm always astounded that people will go and buy a specific breed. And I think that this is what sustains dog markets, is people are not just buying a dog, they're buying a breed of dog that they hope will really fit into their lifestyle. Think about Great Dane. People think, oh, well, a Great Dane is a great apartment dog. That's a story that I know, even though I've rarely encountered Great Danes. Or you get a Jack Russell, they're really smart and active, and they're a small dog that's not so small. They've got some, or a boxer, they're goofballs. We've got these stories and we smile because there are elements of truth to it. But at the same time, that's really quite damaging for the dogs, because it's like we're buying a product and we expect that product to behave in a specific way. And when they don't, we're devastated.
I mean, Mark Beckhoff and Jessica Pierce say, dogs have personalities, breeds don't have personalities. And in some sense, the concept of breed is like species, because it is a category, it's a broad thing, it's a generalizing thing. And so the specificity of every, in some ways you could think of it as an intensification of the category. So you get whatever the breed is into your house, and you've got an expectation, not only will this dog be a kind of in an intimate relationship with me because that's what dogs are like, but in addition to that, it will be in an intimate relationship with me in this way. And, that's obviously very problematic.
I think that's nicely put there, the relationship between breed and species, but you were talking about how much science there is on the socialization of dogs and how much this impacts dogs and dogs' lives.
So there's the science socialization, which is kind of formalized and institutionalized part, and that gets passed down into dog books that people can buy, and various other things as well, classes. But the working classes, for example, the work at home is huge, the amount of work that needs to be done. And obviously lots of people are familiar with, and lots of people don't bother with it, obviously, but so much is so obvious in some ways. What's perhaps more interesting is that even if you have a dog who is, in inverted commas, I'm raising my fingers here, well socialized, at some point in their lives, maybe early on. One of the interesting things, and the pandemic kind of threw this up for me quite a lot, is that basically a dog needs to be socialized all through their lives. Suzanne Clothier, who I really love, she's a behaviorist. I've got a quote from it in the book. I absolutely love what she says. She says basically something like, if they don't do these things that I want them to do, I have to remember that it doesn't matter to them. The reason they don't do it is because they don't care. They don't care about coming back. They don't care about sitting. They don't care about any of those things. And she's basically saying the obligation in that relationship is to make it obvious that you care, that the human cares. And I think that is often missed out quite often in dog-human relationships. And, humans often find it insulting when dogs don't kind of do what they've been trained to do. But the reality is the dog doesn't care about many of the things that you care about and about how you want your relationship to look, especially from the outside. So basically it's this ongoing training, ongoing socialization. And the reason I'm talking about this is basically because it indicates that it's not like you socialize a dog and then they're happy in the home forever. The fact is that dogs, if I could speak freely, I think probably are never really happy in the home. And you constantly have to kind of make it worth it for them and kind of remind them that they're doing this and those kinds of things. And even that can be evidenced even in the most kind of, again, in inverted commas, docile dog or dog that is apparently at ease. I think it's really important to be looking at the dog throughout their life and exactly how they are responding and how are they happy in the house or are they docile, they're absolutely not the same kind of thing. That's absolutely not the same thing.
And I think so much of that species story we talk about is that the human-dog bond is beneficial. It's a win-win. It's a win-win for us and it's a win-win for them. They get a nice home and a thing, full bellies to eat, and they live these happy, full lives. And, I spoke to Angie Pepper on the previous season where we spoke about animals and politics. And towards the end of that episode, I remember her saying, she's not convinced that we are good for dogs, that we... You just look at the number of technologies we have in our homes, like you say, the constant work, the leashes, the muzzles, all of these technologies are very indicative either that they don't fit into our societies in the ways we want them to or expect them to, and that they would much rather be doing something else. And I've got one of those quote unquote problematic dogs. Linus is not an easy dog. He doesn't fit well into society or into our lives. And someone who's an animal studies scholar, I'm trying, and in many ways I feel like it's made this a much more difficult process for both myself and Oliver, because we take Linus as Linus and we're trying desperately to respect him for him and what his needs are. But the truth is the society we live in and his other options are really quite limited. And we can't just let him go because he will nip someone or bark at someone, and that could lead to really devastating consequences for him. So you do, and then it can make social situations really quite daunting. And then you as a human in the situation can get quite frustrated, I think, and without recognizing that, as you say, these are not things that are necessarily important to Linus, and two, he might have not had those social experiences and might actually have pretty negative, bad experiences that we're neglecting to take seriously in these situations. And it's come up many times in the show that pets and the idea of pets are, the more you look at it, the more you realize it is just this, you called them captive animals earlier, and I think that that's exactly right. They are captive animals. If I had a doggy door and Linus could choose to come and go whenever he wants, that would be a very different form of relationship than me deciding when he can go out or when he can leave. And if he decides to leave at my house at all, maybe he wants to go on and do something completely different, but his whole life is defined by myself and Oliver. Sorry, that was a bit of a diatribe, but I think it's a really hard thing to recognize that you're doing the best you can, but you might be very much part of the institutional and structural problems at the same time.
Yeah, it's a very complicated area. And I think that this is one of the things why denaturalizing the kind of unfreedoms of dogs, of all animals, but of dogs, is quite important. So the book is it's got this kind of not straightforward relationship to the subject of the individual, because on the one hand, dogs are hugely individualized, and And on the other hand, when I'm talking about a species story, like all species categories, they kind of completely eradicate the individual, because they're basically saying, this is what a dog is, this is what a dog is like, so a dog should like to be with you or whatever. And if a dog doesn't, they're not properly a dog or whatever. I mean, I suppose in some ways, the book is a kind of classic piece of sociology, ironically. It's never having been a very good sociologist in the past. I think, ironically, this is quite a sociological piece of work, in the sense that I'm saying that it is a problem to reduce dogs as problems to it being a problem with the individual dog, because there is this story a story that kind of erases individuals by saying this is how all dogs should be, but simultaneously turns any problems that they've got into problems that belong somehow to them, rather than to a whole set of expectations and norms and so on, which have all the powerful force of science behind them.
I think as you were talking here, it makes me think about, in many ways, how women were speaking. When women were fighting for women's rights, you had similar kind of tensions happening. People essentializing women and what it means to be a woman by saying, you're docile, or you're in the home, or you're feminine. And this kind of move to essentialize all women and all of the diversity amongst women and their experiences into this really simple, neat story. And that's what essentialization is it makes a simple story that eradicates the complexity and diversity of what it means to be a woman, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, when a woman is saying they're frustrated because they can't get promotion in the workplace, for example, oh, it's your fault as the individual because you are not working hard enough, versus looking at the kind of systemic structures that might not matter how hard you work, you might never reach where it is you're hoping to get because the system, in effect, is working against you.
And that's very complicated in relation to dogs, because I would prefer the term captive to companion. And a captive dog simply cannot, as you say, go anywhere. I mean, in the past, possibly, I remember my mum used to say, where's the dog? The dog's walking himself. So the dog actually would walk himself as opposed to anybody else walking him. This was, I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was. It was quite a few decades ago. But the thing about a dog is that they're captive in the home. And so when we say, you were saying you're not working hard enough, or with a dog, they're being purposely, not doing something or whatever, the dog doesn't have any choices. The dog, to be kind of identified as an aggressive dog, or as there's no way for the dog, there's no movement for a dog in the sense that there might be. I mean, I'm not saying that women are free, but there is at least more freedom to act than a dog who is essentially captive. So you're either enclosed by the walls and the doors, or you're enclosed by a lead.
Yeah, I'm definitely not trying to create a correlation between the experiences of women and dogs. I think I'm just more talking about the mechanism that works in this kind of scaling up to, the scaling up of a category on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the kind of really personal experience of how systems and laws impact your life. And I think, speaking about problems, I think when you become labeled a problem in whatever category, where your world changes, right? Different policies, different practices come into place the second you are labeled a problem, which I think is quite interesting in and of itself. As you say, it's an interesting thing that deserves to be studied. It's quite clear that this is a common practice in our societies that we should be studying and paying attention to. So we've been speaking for an hour already. It's been really fascinating. And just as a bit of a kind of, to recap, I think what we've been saying here. So, I mean, species story is, I think, a really effective and powerful concept for us to use to understand some of these structural dimensions that we've been speaking about for animals, and in particular here for dogs. And maybe there are different characteristics to the species story that can be quite damaging for dogs. One of them being that the human-dog bond is natural and it's unwavering, when in actual fact it actually requires a great deal of work and a great deal of dedication, and it's not natural. It's something that's maintained and sustained at a variety of different levels, from the family to how it's being researched in science. That science is a very important role in the maintaining and sustaining of this narrative, of the story. Not only maintaining the story on paper, but also putting in practice specific actions, how a military dog should behave, how a specific breed should behave. And then that gives kind of, I think, measurements against which these animals are compared. And then all of this in the species stories, you've got the human-dog bond, you've got science, And you've got how it's all attached back to a historical kind of moment at which dogs became dogs. That's often unquestioned, that somehow they would not be dogs unless they were attached to humans. Is there anything that we're kind of missing here in kind of thinking through the broad overarching idea of what a species story is?
No, not at all. That was a brilliant summary. I mean, I think I haven't used the word violence or anything like that. I think probably I haven't tried to keep a fairly light touch on the consequences of that for dogs. But I think partly there's no need to go into that here, because I think a lot of your listeners and you and me kind of know what those consequences are. But that's something that I do talk about in the book. You know, what is it like to be a problem dog, in inverted commas? You know, what is it like to be a problem dog? It's not great. You know, so that's just that dimension, yeah.
No, and yeah, it's not great. And I think as owners, you can find yourself doing things that you didn't expect you'd be doing.
But also the other thing, I draw on Dinesh Waddiwell's work in the chapter on labour and some of the consequences of dogs as species story. You know, in that chapter, I basically argue that this idea of the naturalisation of the dog-human bond has implications for how we understand dogs, whether they work or not. And of course, we can talk about working dogs, but I kind of go into that in quite a lot of detail in the sense that it is true that dogs are working, but it's something that humans would call work, but like a dog would call being a dog, because you're with humans. And towards the end of that chapter, I draw on Dinesh Waddiwell's work where he talks about time. So when I was saying just now, we were talking about, you know, if you are a problem dog, or if you're a dog with inverted commas problems, and I really insist on having that in inverted commas, that can potentially be a lifetime. So Dinesh talks a lot about time of labour. For a dog, that can be a lifetime. That's because, you know, the entirety of a dog's life is dedicated basically to being a dog in the way that we imagine or fantasize that it might be. So it's very serious. It's not just, it's very unpleasant to be unhappy or anxious or angry or fearful or any of those things. It's that you're like, unless without intervention of some kind, you will be like that for a lifetime. And as I have really basically implied the whole way through, whether intervention really works. You know, I think most people who know the dog that I live with would say that, in inverted commas, he's a happy dog. You know, I don't think that. I think he's, you know, getting by. I think he's doing a great job. And I think he has some happy moments. Yeah. And I hope that, you know, he has happy moments all the time. But, you know, I would be very wary about saying that this is necessarily a dog who's living the life that he might live in other circumstances.
I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Turkey here as we're talking about this, because I think this shows the power of the story and the idea that dogs not only belong with humans, but increasingly belong in human homes. Because while we started at the beginning of the episode kind of saying the vast majority of the world's dog populations are not in human homes, one of the kind of beacons for this has been Turkey. For a long time, it's been Turkey and Istanbul in particular. Stray was a brilliant movie that I think, without putting a human voice in it, just showed the complexity and beauty of what a dog's life could be, with the damage, with the dangers, with the risks. And now, of course, they've changed the law and they are going to be rounding up and killing strays to move more towards this Western model of pets in homes. And again, I'm not trying to romanticize what urban dogs, roaming dogs go through or have, but I think it's the only reason I bring this up here is to show the power of the species story. It's not just this fanciful concept that we're talking about in abstract academic words. It has real purchase in legislation, in people's imaginations of where dogs belong. And we're constantly recreating it, and it's moving to other countries and other parts of the world. And I think, we're seeing more and more captive animals. And that's part of the species story, because it doesn't mention the violence of captivity.
The other thing that I talk about a lot in the book is the relationship between, obviously, species and race, but also the ways in which dogs live are racialized. So, and they're kind of part of so-called civilization projects and so on. And that history of Turkey and also Istanbul, but also other cities as well, where dogs are seen, you know, dogs on the streets are seen in a particular way as not, for example, this as a mark of a modern city and so on. But I mean, those are very complicated stories. So, for example, in Iran, pet keeping is seen as a sign of West toxification. So the Iranian government regularly culls dogs in the most nasty way in shelters and on the streets, largely, so basically dogs are, like we're kind of going back to what we were saying right at the beginning, dogs are caught up in all kinds of politics, whether it's the politics of a neighborhood or whether it's the politics of a nation or whether it's the politics of a kind of global geopolitical order. They're caught up in all of those problems.
And of course, coming back to the theme of the season, as has kind of been implicit in a lot of what we're saying, this has huge implications for dogs' mental health, for their physical health, and I would also say for societal health. Maybe I'm going too far, but I think if we're going to address many of the conflicting and problematic relationships we have with animals, both those in our homes and outside of our homes, we have to think seriously about how we treat those that are closest to us. If we're unable to really look at that and its problematic tendencies, and I mean, this is a much bigger debate that we don't have to get into here, but I think it's worth saying that we really need to think seriously about how we relate to those that we say we supposedly care for. And I think we do care for them. I think in our mind we do. We love them. I don't think people are lying when they say they love them. I just don't think there's been the same kind of sensitivity to what that means as you've kind of given us here in this episode today. But let's move to your quote now, if you will, Mariam. Do you have a quote ready for us?
I have a quote. Like many other people, I'll say this was incredibly difficult to do.
It is hard. I didn't think it would be as hard a thing to do as when I first came up with the idea, but it's fun.
Yes, it's really fun. So I've chosen a quote that is important in itself, I think, but also incredibly important to me just in terms of my trajectory and my work. It's in an article that is a set text on every single course I've ever taught on animals, which is quite a lot now. And it's an article that I go back to again and again for lots of reasons. I can say why after I've read it. So the quote comes from the article Do Fish Resist by Dinesh Wadewal. It was published in 2016. So I've done something naughty, Claudia. It's a quote from the beginning and end of the article, but they're directly related. So there's a square paragraph with ... in the middle of this quote. Okay. I argue that conflict is a starting point for thinking about relationality. We are in relation with animals, but this is a relation essentially of hostility. This conflict need not be thought of as a dead end, but can comprise a potential beginning for different and hopefully less violent relationalities. And then at the end, fish create worlds we cannot even understand. They defy our imagination. Our primary relationship with fish, at least so far, has been violent and parasitic. We have quite literally fed off their creativity for our own benefit. Recognizing fish resistance might give us different ways to think about how we might relate to fish beyond simply finding new ways to counter their resistance to us. What would our world look like if we worked with and supported the creativity of fish rather than simply working against it?
Interesting. Really, really. I mean, I'm a big fan of Dinesh's work, but I'm curious what made you decide to pick a quote that focused on, and maybe this is flying in the face of the idea of a species narrative. What made you decide to focus on a quote that foregrounded fish? Well,
I think it's not so much fish. I think the point is relevant to all our relations with animals. I think this is a huge generalization. I hope that I don't regret saying it afterwards, but I feel that we tend to think rather better of our relations with animals than they actually are, that a lot of our relationships really are very hostile. And I kind of agree. I think Dinesh wrote the best title of any book ever, The War on Animals. So I think partly that, and the other thing that's important to me about that argument and the fact that it's fish is significant because, like you say, it's almost the very opposite of a dog. A fish, it's much more difficult to create that feeling of intimacy. As he says, they defy our imagination than it is with a dog. But nevertheless, when I first read this article, which was quite early on, not that long after it was published, I think that a lot of the book, Dog Politics, is about this struggle that I've got with the concept of relationality. I think it's a really difficult concept, much more difficult than I ever thought it was. I think it's done way too much work in terms of, particularly in ethics. And one of the things about this is that he's talking about relationality, but he's not talking about he's not talking about it in a positive kind of way. He's talking about relations of hostility and conflict. And what that led me, it was such an important part of the book and in part of the development of the concept of species story, because species story is basically a form of relation in a way. It's a form of building a relationship with a dog through a story. And I think that's what he's talking about. You know, we should look more closely at relationality is all well and good, but the question is, and nobody would really, nobody would deny relationality, but what is the form that those relations take? And again, Mark Beckhoff talks about the form of the relationship with dogs as being a relation of captivity. So the quality of that relation, or domestication is a form of relation, the quality of that might change. As Portia says, you know, a pig can be treated well or badly, just as a dog can be treated well or badly. But that's not the point. The point is, what is the form of the relationship within which they can be, if they're treated well or badly? So I think that's really an important part for me in relation to a species story, is that it doesn't really matter whether the dog is happy in the home or not. What matters is that there is a form of relationship that is organising that life. And he captures that really well here, just by not assuming that relationality is necessarily good. But the other reason why I chose it as well is because it is fish. I mean, this article to me is simply brilliant. It just absolutely it is a really perfect example of how you can absolutely transform an epistemic frame. You know, it's such a powerful critique of Peter Singer, but there have been many powerful critiques of Peter Singer. But what he does in this article, which is really quite short, it's got a huge number of references, so my students faint because I think it's about 50 pages long. Actually, it's not that long at all. But what he does in that article is make you ask the question about fish in a completely different way. And to me, this is such an enormous achievement. And it's so powerful partly because it is fish. And of course, I haven't done anything even remotely similar to that in relation to dog politics, but it is a kind of ambition, an ambition to try to transform the ways in which we see dogs and transform the way in which a very, very strong epistemic frame shapes the lives of dogs broadly.
Yeah, and I think that's no short. I mean, we spoke about constitutions earlier, and I think if you've only got a limited set of ways of thinking about something, you'll tend to only think you've got a limited number of tools or actions available to you. When you literally start to frame things differently, it can change those options pretty dramatically. Same thing as how we spoke about a problematic dog or not. Literally the options when you become labeled as something versus something else change. And I think there's nothing small in trying to rethink our relationships. And I think people like Dinesh and a lot of the work that's coming out now and trying to imagine multi-species futures is trying to do some of that work. Not always perfectly, of course, but I think rather do it and play with different ideas because I think reframing our relationships is not just something that's fanciful. I sometimes think we're flying in the face of science by reimagining and doing, but it's a lot more powerful than that. You can ask questions that might not have even come to the fore if you hadn't, right?
Exactly. I think that's what he does so brilliantly in that. And also I think his focus in that article on that resistance, you know, it's very helpful. It's been very helpful for me just on a daily basis with Monk, is just always to kind of have the notion of resistance in my mind and what Monk is trying to say or trying to do in terms. So rather than understanding it within any epistemic frame other than a kind of, I'm not saying that everything Monk does is an act of resistance. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that it's a different kind of frame to bring to the relationship and to see how some of the things that he does might be motivated by, you know, the fact that he doesn't, you know, the fact that he's trying to shape his world, basically. So it's been helpful to me at so many different levels, this article, which is why I was really pleased to be able to choose it, even though it's about fish and not dogs.
No, I've no problem with talking about fish. That was really a great thing. So what are you working on now? Is there any follow-up to this book, or what's the plan?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways this quote again relates to that. This question he has, what would our world look like if we worked with and supported the creativity of fish rather than simply against it? At the moment, I'm just writing an article it takes the first half of chapter 6, which is the section on the histories of concepts of race and species. And it really works that through much more slowly in relation to sets of literatures which aren't necessarily directly about animals, but have a bearing on them. So Catherine Yusuf's work, Geologic Life, Eric Barate's work on animal histories, other people's work as well. So I'm basically doing that, but I'm doing it within the context of kind of Anthropocene discourses. So trying to think through what would it look like if we imagined animals differently and imagined that we might work with them in the context of some of the climate change and environmental catastrophes that we're facing. So it's very early days. But it's basically bringing some of the literature, some of the arguments that I developed in dog politics, and bringing it to a different context, which is kind of more to do with environmental humanities and Anthropocene work.
Fantastic. And if folks want to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
I'm actually at Goldsmiths now, but I'm going to be gone next week. So you've got an UCL email address on the website, and that is the best place to contact me. So at UCL, but because of that, I'm in that moment of process. I don't have a website or anything, a web page or anything like that just at the moment.
No problem. If and when you do, I can update.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to be here, Claudia. Thank you.
Hi, Rashmi. Welcome to the Animal Highlights. How are you doing?
Hi, Claudia. Thanks for having me here. I'm really delighted to be part of the Animal Highlights and share my stories about dogs that I work with.
It's so great. And it's really cool to have both you and Priya working on this, the Animal Highlights together. It's been really interesting working with both of you and hearing some of these kind of ethnographic stories and tales about your observations of dogs in India. It's really remarkable. Could you tell us a little bit about your research and what you're interested in?
My research has mostly always been placed at the interface of human and non-humans, particularly humans, dogs, and wild animals. And presently, I'm a PhD candidate in the Center for Compassionate Conservation at UTS, which is University of Technology, Sydney. And there, my research is trying to identify and understand the transformations in the socio-ecological realities of these human-dog relationships, especially in the Himalayan context.
Were you always interested in animals and dogs, or did this just come about through your studies? How did you find your way to animal studies?
I mean, I was introduced to wildlife studies while I was still in my undergrad. I had volunteered for this this NGO that was studying leopard ecology and their interactions with humans. So that was the first time I had a chance with interacting with rural communities in the central Indian landscape of Kanha and Pench. So it was around the common leopard there. And that also introduced me to ecological study and social studies with interviews and whatnot. So that's where my interest began in human animal studies, essentially. And then I took it forward in my master's and now my PhD.
Oh, so interesting. Okay, I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have for us today.
There were many thought-provoking points in your interview with Mariam about dogs' species story. And while Mariam is, with good reason, critical of the species story about the human-dog bond, for my doctoral research, I am exploring how humans and dogs have coexisted, co-evolved, and co-partnered in these Himalayan landscape. And part of the reason for my interest in the shared histories of humans and dogs is to offer additional alternative narratives to the existing ideas of a dog's place or position in an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And in my observations, dogs and humans have a lot more nuanced and complex relationships that need to be explored and given attention to. One of the earliest and most enduring partnerships between humans and dogs is the one between shepherds and their guardian dogs that are essentially known to protect livestock, commonly sheep or goat, and sometimes cattle. So these livestock guardian dogs are not pet dogs. They're known to be, the fierce protectors of their livestock flocks, and I would argue also of their own shepherds. And these dogs are acknowledged for their ability to detect and deter predators like wolves, leopards, and bears. And to learn more about the stories of these Himalayan guardian dogs, I stayed with different shepherd camps in the alpine pastures in Himachal Pradesh in India.
What an amazing landscape to be in and to work in. How long were you there for?
For this field season, I was there for about a month. But before that, previous year, I've been there for a longer time. I've been there, like I've spent 6 months at a stretch in the last year when I was there.
Wow, incredible.
So, yeah, one of the shepherds that I met spoke fondly of a female guardian dog, Lali, who was part of his herd till a few years back before she passed. The shepherd recalled proudly that the dog knew no fear. He says that she was able to chase away fierce predators like bears all by herself without needing other dogs to accompany her. And at night, I did not need to remove the blanket from my face to look around the camp, for I was assured that when Lali is with me in my camp, my livestock cannot be harmed by any predators. She would not allow it. So much like Lali, other guardian dogs also tend to, remain vigilant, alert, and patrolling throughout the night for any signs of unwanted intrusions in their shepherd camps. And also, on account of her fearless nature, the shepherd fitted her with a special collar. And these are not like your regular pet collars. These collars are made of, iron and nowadays of aluminium, but they have like these metallic spikes on them, which is basically to prevent deadly attacks from predators like the leopards who kill by strangulation and puncturing of the neck. So it is more to protect the dog from being attacked, to death.
Wow.
And yeah, also another shepherd shared how his guardian dogs are also able to effectively communicate if they sense any danger. So, like, there's another quote saying that, my dogs let me know if they feel there is a predator near our camp. Their bark changes entirely. They tell me it is time for me to come out of my shelter with a torch and follow them. I will also have to shout loudly to let them know that I am there as well. I will join or accompany my dogs in the direction that my dogs tell me and help in shooing away the predators. In fact, I also witnessed this fierce vigilance firsthand. So once, when staying at the shepherd camp, my sleep was broken by a loud, unsynchronized cacophony of barks right outside of my tent. And I checked the time, and it was around 2:30 in the morning. So I
Sure.
climbed out of my tent to see what the dogs were up to. And all I could see from my poor, feeble headlamp was Simru, who was a small Tibetan Lhasa Apso type dog, dashing across the camp, barking ferociously. And right behind her were the other three dogs named Sheru, Bhuru, and Kalu. And the shepherds had also come out of their own shelter with their better long range torches. And we saw the four dogs race up the slope, their barks echoing all around us. And as they reached a vantage point beyond which we cannot see, their barks started to, intensify.
Mm.
So one of the shepherds started making loud noises, trying to scare off what is most likely lurking wolf or a pack of wolves, though we couldn't see a thing at night. And the other shepherd got busy in herding and bringing the livestock closer to the camp to prevent them from scattering about in panic. And after a tense standoff of about a few minutes, two of the dogs had returned, apparently satisfied that the coast was clear or something. But even as I went back to sleep, I could hear the occasional barks from different directions, which is just a testament to the unwavering vigilance of these guardian dogs.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting, the kind of comparison of dog barks here, because I think with pet dogs in cities, so often we're trying to quell their barks. We don't take their barks seriously in any sort of way, right? We're like, stop
Yeah.
barking, like leave it, it's okay. Like we don't really take their barks seriously, but in your context and environment, it's really their barks are serious business, right?
Yeah, that's true. In fact, the shepherds were not able to express or tell me in words how they know that the barks are different. I mean, I asked them, okay, how do you know that the dogs are barking because there's an intruder? Because I would
Mm.
often hear dogs bark while I was there, even when there was no intruder or predator or a threat that I could or that we could observe at that time. No, they had definitely had a way of knowing that okay, the dogs are barking for at something now. It's something serious and not just
Not
them
just,
barking.
but it's
Yeah.
true. I mean, you see it, and I mean, people will say this also with regards to, like, we think about speech as being so important, but People will say this with regards to babies as well. There are different types of cries, whether they know it's a serious cry or a cry asking for something. And Linus, who's at home with me here, my dog, not my baby, my dog, Linus, he's got very different barks. Like if I'm in the kitchen and I hear a single whoop, I know that that's him asking me for help. And it's a very different type of bark to him barking out the window. So it's remarkable. Like it's not a word, or is it a word? I don't know. That's a different conversation for another time. But yeah, I'm not surprised to hear these shepherds know that different barks have different meanings.
Yeah, it's true. And also that these guardian dogs, they're not just on the lookout for predators. They're also keenly aware of their surroundings. They're keeping an eye out for anything unusual, including strangers. So they would bark at any stranger that they would see coming into their camp. And that those barks would, again, also be different, and the shepherds would be able to recognize if it's a human or, a bigger threat, so to say. So just as a pet dog might bark at an unfamiliar visitor, these guardian dogs also protect their territory, which is the pasture lands that they share with their flocks. And it's actually common knowledge that approaching a shepherd's camp without the shepherd present can actually be risky because of the guardian dogs, because they might mistake you for a threat. So if we have to be, even when we went there, we had to be really careful because there's no network then, there's no way for us to tell or alert the shepherds beforehand. So our visits were often, not always actually, unannounced. So we had to be really careful about the dogs being present and us making loud noises. And then the shepherds would, maybe look at us or hear us and calm their dogs down. So basically, to gain the trust of the dogs, you need to introduce yourself to the dogs in the presence of the shepherds, or maybe the dog needs to know that you're not a threat and maybe a friend of the shepherd. So then they resume doing what they were doing. Not just for, I mean, about these, like being fiercely aware of their surroundings, they're also known to be not just vigilant, but like really loyal, and loyal not just to their shepherds but also to their own livestock, the flock, the sheep and goat. So one shepherd shared a memory from his childhood. He said, "My father's guardian dog was a loyal companion and fiercely devoted to the safety of his flock. One evening, after returning to camp with the livestock, my father realized the dog was missing. He searched all night but couldn't find him. Next morning, he went out to search for him in the forest above the night camp. Following the sound of the dog's barks, he finally spotted him. To his surprise, the dog was attempting to drag a severely injured goat. So apparently, the goat had been injured. The goat had injured her leg while she was grazing, and she was unable to return to camp. And the dog stayed back with the goat, within and guarded her all night in the wilderness. And that even meant missing his dinner, which is only a second meal. So he was
Wow.
quite devoted to protecting that goat, especially. And I mean, they're also used in, I mean, because we know that dogs have such a strong sense of smell, and that really comes in handy for shepherds, especially when the shepherds need to look for livestock, or that go missing, that they can't find. So, in fact, there was one instance when in one of the camps, the shepherds had noticed that one of the sheep who had given birth to a lamb the same day in the grazing pastures did not return with the rest of the flock in the evening. So he climbed back up the steep mountains to search for the sheep and the newborn, but he was unable to find them in the dim light because the sun was setting fast. So early next morning, he set out again to search for the sheep, and but this time he made sure that he would take along his dog with him. So, and as expected, because of the dog's keen sense of smell, the dog was quickly able to pick up the scent of the missing sheep, and he led the shepherd to, a stack of boulders and rocks behind which the sheep and her lamb were safely hiding. So that was quite incredible
Mm.
to observe.
Are they trained to do that kind of tracking?
No, no, to track the sheep, no, not really. I mean, I think they anyways have a sense of smell, so they just went about looking, because at that time it was really early in the morning and no livestock was around in the grazing pasture. All of them was back in the camp. So I think
Okay.
when the dog into the grazing pasture, the dog was just going where the livestock was, or he basically wherever he could follow the scent. But that's an interesting point, actually, if they're trained especially to for these search operations,
Mm.
which I'm not sure about at this moment.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, you'd expect that there are many stimulating things in the environment that the dog could early in the morning choose to run towards if they don't know that they're actively going towards the sheep. But maybe it's a sheep that they can smell and they're aware of, so they're running. So there's many reasons for why the dog might choose to run, but one of them could be that they have been asked to find the sheep because they've been trained to understand that kind of prompt. So yeah, I guess I mean the question is whether it was self-directed finding the sheep or whether
Mhm.
asked, which is just interesting.
Yeah. That is quite interesting. But I mean, even if they do the job that they're supposed to do, or whether they're trained at it, or and if they end up successfully doing it, they're not really. I mean, they're not treated as house pets.
Mm,
They do not. They're not expected, or at least they're not really given any treats for a job well done. So, dog will
yeah,
not be other than maybe words that they use like shabash shabash, which is basically saying them, telling them that good job. I mean,
yeah,
other than this verbal communication, there's not any reward that I saw them. Saw the shepherds give the dogs if they'd done something that, done something well, maybe chase the predator away or something. They're not really rewarded, or I did not see them being rewarded.
okay,
And even, I mean, they don't even get, beds or shelter to sleep in. Even if the bed weather is bad, they have to remain amidst the elements, come rain or snow. And this is part of their training, to remain close with the livestock flock at all times. So that's one of the ways that I guess the shepherds ensure that the dogs always stay with the flock. They moved away from the camp, so their camps are made of like stone shelters, and they feed the dogs, and then they shoot away to move behind the flock and remain there throughout the
mm,
night, especially because that's the time where they need the dogs the most to be alert. And some dogs are really smart. They will go and sleep right in the middle among the sheep, because then they'll get the warmth from the sheep wool. So some dogs are smart and do that. But yeah, unlike also other pet dogs, one difference that I could see was that they're free to move about in the vast pastures as they will. They're not restricted to remain in any place. And as soon as the harsh sun would begin to set in the evening, I would see these dogs play, dash, chase each other, in this limitless grassy meadows for hours on end, or until they tired. So that was something very nice to for someone like me to see.
yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, just having that kind of autonomy and freedom to run around and play when you want to is quite remarkable. Yeah,
But this is not to say that their lives don't come with their own challenges. Occasionally, there are direct and often violent encounters between these guardian dogs and the predators, like wolves, who are also typically in packs because they are also social animals. And in fact, in one of the shepherd camps that I visited, there was a gravely wounded black dog. Her name was Kali, and there was a deep wound on her abdomen and also around her left eye. And in fact, there was no eyelid on the left eye; it was completely off.
sure.
So, together with her fellow camp dogs, guardian dogs, she engaged in a face-off with two wolves who had entered the camp the previous night, the night before we visited the camp. And in that encounter, the wolves were somehow able to corner her, and they ended up severely wounding her. The other dogs kind of backed away, so they were safe. But I mean, despite her serious injuries, Kali and the other dogs were able to successfully protect the flocks and not have any livestock or sheep or goat injured. But it did end up injuring her severely.
Mm,
And we were not very, I mean, the shepherds are not very hopeful that Kali would make it. And unfortunately, we don't know if she made it after, I mean, if she was able to recover from her injuries, because there was no way for them to treat her because the injuries were quite deep and serious.
sure. I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, I mean, speaking about multi-species health, that's quite a noteworthy thing. Like, I mean, bodily health. It's interesting because in some ways you kind of contrasted mental health there and bodily health. I mean, they're probably very physically healthy because they get a lot of exercise, but there are some real serious dangers to the kind of work they do.
Definitely, without a doubt. But I mean, it's because of this work that they do, or these encounters, that they're sort of protecting the livestock and the shepherds. So I think it's because of this that it's no surprise that the shepherds do recognize and cherish these guardian dogs who are their constant companions and sort of invaluable helpers in these harsh, challenging terrain. And it seems that the dogs are indispensable and, in fact, irreplaceable parts of a shepherd's life in the Himalaya. And in fact, one old shepherd he said that, we couldn't continue our pastoral way of life without dogs. And I'm sure that every shepherd would wholly agree to that.
All right. Thank you so much for that today. I think your story is interesting considering that it comes on the back of the conversation with Mariam, where we speak about a species story or a dog story. Because in many ways, you're talking here about this kind of bond between humans and dogs, which of course Mariam is very much troubling and questioning throughout the episode. But in some ways, you're speaking beyond just the bond and saying how the work of pastoralism involves the working together of humans and dogs.
Mhm. Yeah, that's correct. So while I am interested in how human dog relationship has developed, I do agree with Miriam's points that that it may not be a truly naturalized relationship because these dogs, although they might have instincts to protect their territory or guard their territories, they're not really livestock guardian dogs. They're made to become effective livestock guardian dogs through a variety of training methods. They're also often taken away from their mothers at a young age to be given to other shepherds. And that is where they're taught through vigorous training or through looking at other older shepherd dogs that are there in the camp. And if the dogs do not perform in the desired ways, then they might also be subjected to punishment like scolding or beating. So, or even maybe not keeping the dog as a livestock guard anymore. I guess that it is definitely a relationship or a partnership that takes a lot of work and needs to be constantly maintained.
Yeah, that was such an important point that came up, I think, also in the conversation with Mariam, that it doesn't just exist. Like any relationship, it's not just like this natural thing that exists. It requires a certain amount of work and maintenance. Well, super interesting. I'm looking forward to your next animal highlight. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you to Mariam Motamedi-Fraser for an incredible interview and for also sending me a copy of her book. Thank you so much. It's an incredible book and you were a wonderful guest. To Jeremy John for the logo, Gordon Clark for the bed music, and to Rashmi Singh Rana for today's animal highlight. A big thank you also to Rebecca Shen for her design work. Thank you so much to our sponsors, which include Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, as well as the Remaking One Health Indies project. This episode was produced by myself and edited together with Christian Maintz. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hertenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.